As we prepare for Rosh Hashanah, we can draw some lessons from the Torah laning. Particularly, I'd like to focus on Yishmael. The Torah tells us that when Yishmael was in the desert and his mother had cast him aside without water, and they were both saddened about their prospects, the Torah tells an interesting pasuk, Vayishma Hashem et kol hanar, that God heard the nar cry, which is Yishmael, and the Torah concludes the pasuk as Ba'asher hu sham. First of all, it's interesting to note that God heard the voices of the nar and not the voice of his mother. Assuming that his mother also cried, it was Yishmael's voice that was heard. Rashi points out that the reason why Yishmael's voice was heard is that Hagar was desperate and despaired and desolate, and as a result of her desperation, she gave up. And when giving up, she was no longer crying and praying for salvation. She was crying out of sadness and mourning. A prayer that comes out of desperation and mourning is not a prayer for salvation. Rather, it is a prayer of expressing, it is a crying of grief. There's that reason why Yishmael's voice was heard by Yishma Hashem et kol hanar, because the nar, Yishmael, was crying for salvation. But it's more important to focus on the second half of the pasuk. And the second half of the pasuk is very telling and instructive. Ba'asher hu sham. God heard the voice of Yishmael crying at the moment that he was there. Being students of exegesis, certainly we understand that the voice was heard at that point. It wasn't heard in a different point of time during history. Ba'asher hu sham seems extraneous. Rashi points out, quoting from the Talmud, that Ba'asher hu sham means that he was judged in the moment that he was crying, not what he would do in the future. God wasn't listening and looking at a person in the moment and then projecting where he or she would be in the future, but rather heard the voice of this boy crying as he was in that moment. In that moment, he was sincere, he was authentic, he was crying out and articulating his deep connection to God for salvation. And those moments of crying out and beseeching God for mercy were the moments that inspired salvation from God, Ba'asher hu sham. It's an interesting and a very important critical part of tshuva. Well, some of us think as we go through the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur service that we need to begin to chart a future that we can't really control and predict, but that's the future that will ultimately be the judge of our actions today. To the contrary, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and the Aseret Yemei Tshuva, we are looked at in the moment that we're standing in front of the Borei Olam, in the moment that we're looking at ourselves and that we're engaged in introspection and that we're beginning to think about ourselves authentically and honestly, both our strengths and our weaknesses. The process of investigating and self-inspection and introspection gives us the opportunity to stand in front of the Borei Olam, Rosh Hashanah, Ba'asher hu sham, in that moment. Oftentimes in life, we are looking towards the future, the next horizon, the next accomplishment, the next end, the next goal, the next objective. And in the process of always looking forward, we don't always pay attention to the moment in life, which is so critical to actually shaping and forming the future horizons of our lives. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, if taken seriously, if looked at in the moment of how we are, a snapshot, not a video stream, but a snapshot of how we are in that moment, can have far-reaching implications to where we will be in the future. And thankfully, prayers are listened to and prayers are heard, not necessarily by what one thinks will be in the future, but much more how a person is in that moment. So in Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur and the Aseret Yemei Tshuva, when we have opportunities to add more mitzvot, when we have opportunities to engage in a higher level of thinking spiritually, and we can think about ourselves in ways that are outside our normal life, and we don't get stuck in a mindset. Don't become cynical and say, well, we're only acting this way because it's the Aseret Yemei Tshuva. To the contrary. Use the Aseret Yemei Tshuva, use Rosh Hashanah, and use Yom Kippur for those moments to enhance both our interaction with others, our spiritual lives, our commitment to mitzvot, and then the horizon could be changed beautifully and dramatically by Ba'asher hu sham.